Your presentation will be no better than the story you tell. Does anyone have like a super embarrassing, like unrequited love story from grade 8? I got a good one. It was at camp, grade 8, and co-ed camp. And there was this girl named Karen who was in cabin 6. And I liked her a lot back then. And I remember like, it was a big like open field. All the boys' cabins were on one field outside, all the girls' cabins were on the other. And I can remember laying in my bunk. There's a little window in the cabin, and you could see all the way across the field. You could see cabin 6, and I knew Karen was in cabin 6. And one night, a bunch of grade 8 boys talking about who they liked in our cabin. And everyone said, James, who do you like? Who do you like? And I was like, no, I am not going to tell you people. I am too smart for that. And they're like, no, who do you like? Who do you like? Well, there's someone. Her name starts with a K, and she's in cabin 6. So the next day, camp counselors making all the kids run around and play ridiculous games, as camp counselors do. And someone from my cabin, I could see it happen. I could see it happen. Over the other side of the field. A little conference with cabin 6. And I was like, oh no. You ever have that feeling? Like you probably died on the inside. So, playing this big game, eventually, in the scrum of whatever ridiculous game it was, someone from my cabin runs over to Karen and says, Karen, you know James loves you? And in front of the entire camp, she yelled, yeah, well, I hate his guts. So storytelling is really powerful. And that's in multiple dimensions. Both in, I started telling you about like an embarrassing thing that happened to me in grade 8, and we were all together in the room. But also, as we'll talk about, that story was a part of my life. Like that story went with me. It wasn't until like significantly, later on into my later teens that I realized that like that story, not just what happened, but how I told myself the story of what happened had influenced, had changed my understanding and relationship to women as a person. It's a story. When we tell stories in academia, this is usually the story we tell. We introduce it, we tell about our methodology, and then we share the results, and then we have a discussion. MRAD. It's fantastic in many ways because it allows you and I to pick up a research paper from pretty much anywhere in the world and know where we need to go in that paper to find what it is we're trying to figure out. However, while there is nothing inherently wrong and there are merits and strengths to this format, this way to tell the story of something that happened, there are some limitations. Research conferences are one such limitation. Because you show up at a research conference and you go to the first session and you go to the second session and you go to the third, fourth, fifth, sixth session and you have heard the same narrative arc 6 times. You've heard the same story, different characters, different data, but you've heard the same story over and over and over again, which is why I feel like, I will speak only for myself, research conferences also feel they have a Groundhog Day quality to them, right? Like you've gone to one session, you've gone to all the sessions in some respects. And there are ways that we can reimagine this. Like we could think about, starting with the results. What if the beginning of your presentation was X% of Y things Z? Well, what could that mean? Just jump right into it. It's not going to say that you're not going to talk about your methodology, but you're going to shift the way you think about the story. What if you thought about telling the methodology as a story, as a first-person account from some participant in the story, or some sample in the story? If you turn your discussion points into like debatable propositions, structured your talk in that way. My point is simply this, that your presentation does not equal the paper. And this is great, because the paper is there, it's done. People can read it, people can engage with it, absolutely. And if it's not there already, then make some preprint of it available for the people who are in the room. But do not be beholden to introductions, methodology, results, and discussion as the architecture for your talk. It can if you want to, but I would not, I would not suggest it. There's some great science around storytelling. Why stories work. The idea of neural entrainment is that they synchronize our brain. So the story I just told you about Karen, not only did I have you for a second, everyone was like, oh, he's going to say something awkward about himself, I'm in. Like, there was that. But there was also this synchronization that happened. So when I talked about the cabins being on either end, on either side of a big field, you were thinking about something like a field, and you were thinking about something like a cabin. I was bringing you to something concrete, and in that moment, if you put us all in fMRI machines at the same time we heard that story, there is a relatable pattern that shows up when I talk about those cabins in that field, because I'm telling you in a story. And we're all there together in that moment. So, incredibly meaningful, incredibly powerful, to be able to bring everyone in a room together around the same thing. They provide some kind of perceptual coherence. So you can think about story just as a thing that we tell one another, but how we make sense of the world. So out there is a bunch of data, right? A bunch of information, bam, 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 hitting us from all directions. Well, somehow, in spite of all that data, you make sense of the world. How is it? Well, you've strung together enough things that make the world make sense to you. We tell each other stories, but our brain is telling us a story all the time. Like, we are in a narrative mode all the time. Not just in the sense of stories that of what I experienced in grade 8 affect who I am. Yes, but like just how we make sense of the world as a whole. So in this perspective, like narrative story, I like to say, like, it's in the source code of being human. It's like the central operating system, perceptually, of how we make sense of the world. I ask you anything. How was that conference that you went to today on presenting? What was it like to get here? What's most meaningful to you? You're going to tell me a story. Finally, there's what we could call biophysical entwinement. And that is that stories connect bodies and brains. And there are, of course, really cool studies that look at this, but you don't really need an fMRI study to tell you this, because you have sat on the couch in your living room reading a book with a racing heart and sweaty palms. In your living room, on the couch, accelerating your heart rate from a story. Like, you think about that, that's just incredible, right? A sequence of narratives that someone's put together, and I have a physical reaction to it. Narrative has evolved the features that it has because these are the features that get people to pay attention to something, to engage with it, to be affected by it, and to react accordingly, including passing the message on. So to bring us back to where we started, we think about like the first principles of the human animals that we're trying to communicate with. A long time ago, we needed a way for me to be able to tell you something, and you to tell someone else, and you to tell someone else, and that somehow that could travel not just across space, but also across time. We evolved a way to do that, and narrative is what we evolved to be able to do that. It's core to how we navigate the world, yes, but then also make sense of everything from civilization and society to, well, what relational issues am I carrying with me from previous experiences? It's the thread that's tying all those things together. Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. And I like at this point in the talk to throw up this big caution slide and to say, to tell a great story is to hijack the central processing unit of another human being. This is an incredibly powerful skill to develop and to harness. And it can just as easily be used for nefarious purposes as well as virtuous ones. I think a great reason to study narrative, to study storytelling, is not just to be able to communicate effectively, but to realize when your own mental apparatus is being hijacked by someone else using this tool. So I'm going to do a little crash course on narrative theory, with the purpose of asking, well, how can we work together to transform the research that you're seeking to communicate into a story? How can we give it a narrative arc? What are the tools at our disposal to do that? I'm going to use 10 aspects of narrative theory. Narrative theory being a rather interdisciplinary branch of people who look at narrative and both ask, how is it that we make sense of narrative? And also, how is it that narrative defines who we are? Now, I am not going to rush through these. I want to take a bit of time and give you a little bit of space to ask if any of these if you see aspects of these elements in a way that you could communicate your story. I'll unpack this as we go. So first dramatic element I want to look at is the idea of desire, which is to ask either what do you want, what is it that someone in a story you might tell about your research want. What we ask of theater is the spectacle of a will, striving towards a goal, without which we say there is no drama, only description. If you share a whole bunch of data and there is no character in the data that wants something, it is just data. Tell me about the most interesting story you ever heard where nobody and nothing in the story wanted anything. Does that even count as a story? I don't mean desire in that this is like this really selfish, preoccupied, I want, gimme. Although for a long time Disney movies had an I want, gimme song because they kind of followed this arc all the way through, right? For that era of Disney, there was a gimme I want song in every story, because that was such a very powerful way for us to understand what the protagonist wanted and what was driving them and what was motivating them. So that became a bit of a cliche, obviously, but fundamentally, if someone tells you a story and nobody in the story wants something, that is going to be, if you can count it as a story, it's not going to be very engaging. In the ecosystem of your research, where is desire? It could be desire on the part of the researchers. It could be desire on the part of subjects. It could be desire on the part of an institution or a sector. I don't know. It could be desire anywhere, but try to find where it is that there is want for something. And once you've figured out or have thought about desire, then you can ask this second question, which I think is really powerful, which is, well, what is the risk? Or in other words, somebody in the story wants something in the story wants something. If they don't get the something they want, what is on the line? So here's a simple test to apply to any story. Ask, what is the risk? What does the protagonist stand to lose if they do not get what they want? If the answer is, should the protagonist fail, life would go back to normal, this story is not worth telling. It's not worth telling because there's nothing riding on it. Now, the story of multimillionaire wants another yacht has desire, but what is the risk of that story? The story of millionaire needs to refinance everything they have to buy another yacht because someone has kidnapped their child. There's something on the line. What is on the line? If the research is not taken up, if the research is not put into practice, if the right people aren't able to act upon it, what is the risk? You can think about inciting incidents, the moments that the first dominoes that cause other dominoes to fall over. And you can ask this question of many things, but even of yourself. At one point, there was a version of you who was not researching the thing that you're researching. There was a version of you that doesn't have the knowledge or the information you now possess. It's interesting to think about, well, what happened? Even if it's just a 30-second anecdote at the beginning of your story that tells a little bit about why it is that you care. Changes everything. Weakness. The only way you can describe a human being truly is by describing their imperfections. The perfect human being is uninteresting. It is in the imperfections of life that we are lovable. The story about Karen. Just come back on this for a second. If you all came back from break and I said, turn to the person next to you and tell them about a time someone broke your heart, you would have looked at me and said, no way, buddy. But I led with it. And I gave, like, if after that story, I said, okay, you know what? Like, we're going to have a little space to talk about some of these stories. Like, by sharing my vulnerability, like, changes the narrative of the room. So it's interesting. I know you can't A/B test this. I know there's not, like, no parallel universe. But imagine, let's suppose you were going to give, like, a keynote address at a conference. And you walk up to the podium and you start with, we completely messed this up. Versus you standing up at a podium and saying, we figured out the answer to such and such a problem. You can talk about the same research. You can talk about the same story and the same findings. But if you bring into the story you're telling your humanity, it changes the dynamics of the room because, as we'll talk about later, and some of us talked about over break, you are signaling to everyone, I am not playing a status game with you. I am not going to try to signal to you that I am exhibiting some status regime higher than you. And that changes the way humans interact with each other in a very fundamental way. Character. Character is the kind of thing which discloses the nature of a choice. For this reason, speeches in which there is nothing at all, which the speaker chooses or avoids, does not possess character. Aristotle. What Aristotle, I think, is getting at here is that I imagine myself going to a theater, and I imagine a play. And one of the characters in the play gets up and performs a monologue. And their monologue is very interesting, and it's very eloquent, and it has all sorts of engaging language, yada, 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 yada. But if at the end of the monologue, that character hasn't chosen between one thing and another thing, between something that's bad and something that's really bad, or between something that's good or really good. If the character doesn't choose something, well, I actually don't know what the character is. I actually don't know who the character is. It turns out that people performing monologues in theater are like human beings. They can tell you one thing and then do something else. But when somebody decides something, it tells you who they are. And the more pressure they're under when they make that decision, the more it exhibits something about their character. Again, you will not watch a Hollywood movie again the same after looking at some of these, because movies regularly, right, drive a protagonist to a point where they have to make an extremely difficult decision. But in the difficult decision, then you know who they are, who they really are, despite everything that else they've said. I love an example like Harrison Ford, like in Star Wars. Harrison Ford is, what's his name? Han Solo, thank you. Han Solo, you're like, this guy's in it for himself, right, the whole way through. Just selfish bastard. But he comes back at the end. He makes a choice. He makes a choice at the end that tells you something about who he is that is actually different than everything that he's told you about himself all the way through the movie. Coming out of a long time ago, very far away, in the context of a presentation, you know, if you're talking about your methodology, and instead of just saying we did this, you say, well, there was blood, sweat, and tears about deciding whether we would do it this way or this way. And we landed on this way, and maybe that wasn't the right decision, but here's what we did. Like, you've invited, without saying it explicitly, you have created a character in that story. Conflict. A protagonist and their story can only be as intellectually fascinating and emotionally compelling as the forces of antagonism make them. Which is to say, if you have the good person, and it's the good person versus the bad person, but the bad person doesn't put up a fight, that doesn't tell you anything about how good your good person is. It doesn't tell you anything about what they're willing to sacrifice. It doesn't tell you anything about what they really value. You need the force of antagonism if you're going to tell us something about the protagonist. And the forces of antagonism in research, they often kind of go assumed or they go unspoken. But it's sometimes worth saying, well, what are they? What is the force of antagonism? And it can be nature, it can be a trend, it can be something about the way society is organized. But what is it? What is getting in the way? What is pushing back? If it was we did the research and here's the policy change that needs to be made, and it was a clear shot, easy, turn the dial, and the change is on, that's probably A, not true, and it's B, not compelling. What's pushing back? What's the problem? Reversals. Reversals are when there's some kind of polar change in the energy. The reversal is a change of the situation into the opposite. Now, again, watch for this next time you watch a movie. So think of each movie you watch by each scene. And at the beginning of a scene, the characters enter the scene believing something, knowing something to be true, seeking something, trying to figure out something, desirous of something. Great, yep, scene starts. At the end of the scene, something needs to have changed. If you watch a movie and a whole scene happens where everyone exits the scene believing the same things, wanting the same things, thinking the same thing, you will ask yourself implicitly, what was the point of that scene? It's like reading a chapter in the book. If you read a chapter in the book and the feeling is the plot didn't change, it's because there was no reversal along the way. And we talk about some tools to think about this in terms of communicating research, but it's great thinking about because we often stand up when we're communicating our research with A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's a very linear, sequential statement of facts. Reversals are like, whoa, you thought it was going one way. You thought at the beginning of the scene the thing was moving in one direction, but it just got pivoted one way or the other. Social status, shifts in hierarchy. It's hard to conceive of an effective story that doesn't rely on some form of status movement to squeeze our primal emotions, seize our attention, drive our hatred, or earn our empathy. I like big, bold, declarative statements like that because they make me think. But if you have any spare bandwidth between now and the end of our session this morning, think about a story that doesn't involve social movement of character or characters, especially the protagonist. Like a story where they either start here, go through a bunch of things and end exactly where they were, or start here and just go straight line across. Where do we find status movement or shifts in status in the way we communicate our research? And very often, the easiest place to find that is in ourselves, like a journey. Discovery or reveal, light bulb moments. A discovery, as the term implies, is a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing either friendship or hatred in those who are destined for good fortune or ill. I like this one because we intuitively, we're calibrated on this one because we're sharing our research. And implicitly, you're sharing research, you are sharing some kind of discovery, something not known that is known now. But I wanted to throw it out here to emphasize that it is just one dynamic of a story. And if it's the only dynamic you have of a story, it doesn't stand by itself. Like a discovery without conflict, without desire, without like just discovery all by itself is pretty wobbly as a narrative. So what's important, and we're going to gravitate to it probably in our context, but it's worth thinking about what other pillars make it meaningful as a narrative, as a dramatic element. This takes some work, but you can ask, what is the climax of the story, which is different than a discovery, and it's different than a reversal, but it's the revelation that the meaning of the story is the meaning of the story. And that was not meant to be as cryptic as it sounds. Maybe use an example. I'm old. Some of us look old in the room too, so this is okay. Mary Poppins. Have we seen Mary Poppins, the movie? Some, but okay. At least 30% of the people just nodded, so I'm going to go for it. Everyone else, you should go watch Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins. The final scene of Mary Poppins is George Banks and his family flying kites together. What the final scene of Mary Poppins tells us is that this story was actually about a family reconnecting. It was actually about connection. It's not even about Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins isn't even the final scene. That whole thing was it just got us to here. That the arc of this story, what the story means, the climax of the story is that this family was disconnected and now they are connected. And you don't read that on the back of the cover or the poster. You don't read that. It's not even in the title, right? But that's what the story means. And the story brought us there. Can you do the mental labor? And I mean, this can be labor sometimes to ask, well, what does the research mean? Right? Not just did it get published. Not just did we share it. Not just did we engage our stakeholders. But yeah, great. It's all good. It's all good. But what does it mean? So there are some dramatic elements. Think about them next time you're watching a series or a show or even reading a book. They're incredibly powerful and powerful devices, and they engage us in a pretty primordial way for obvious reasons. But look for them. Think about them. If you were going to write a screenplay, you would take all of those dramatic elements that you've identified in, okay, here's how we could incorporate some of those into how we communicate our research. And if you were going to make a Hollywood movie, you'd do something like this. You would think about X being the time that you're going to tell the story, and you think about Y, the Y-axis being the tension. And you could think about those dramatic elements that you've identified in your research. They don't need to necessarily be presented in some kind of linear way, as in timeline of reality in which they occurred. But you could think about, well, how could you use those to tell a story? Could you invite some crises and some moments where you've got the reversal, the thing is going really well, and then bam, it's not going really well. It's helpful to think about this, and if you feel like looking at a whole bunch of charts like this, you can go into Google Images or whatever and look for plot timelines, character arcs, classical arcs, and there are different ones. But for most of us, I think trying to turn our research into a Marvel movie, of which this is every Marvel movie that you have ever seen, doesn't necessarily help us do what we're trying to do in the context we're trying to do it in. So I would say it's worth thinking about. big plot arcs. But just as, if not more important, just to think about how is it that desire and conflict and choice and discovery, how is it that those dynamics are just in the DNA of how I am talking about my work? And you don't need to kind of arbitrarily jam it into some kind of escalating sequence of events in order to do that. There are some kind of quick and dirty, easy templates that might be helpful. And I'll share a few of them with you just briefly. David Edgar, playwright, used the idea of but in a log line. A log line is like the description of a story. So when you go into Netflix, for instance, and like you see the movie and then there's a little description of what's coming up. Kind of the modern version of a log line. David Edgar's exercise was, okay, great, you're going to tell a story. You need the word but in that log line. The log line needs to tell the story of what's going to happen, but it's got to hinge on a but. For example, we could say academics are regularly expected to present their research at conferences, which requires thoughtful consideration of presentation structure and delivery. Maybe that could be a log line. If you add a but, I could say academics are regularly expected to present their research at conferences, but typically receive little or no support or training around presentation structure and delivery. Now, just by I saying the same thing, but I've stuck a word but in there to create a problem, or to identify a problem, to be explicit, perhaps, about a problem. Our study found that students who use social media platforms to discuss academic topics reported higher levels of engagement and collaboration than their peers, but the data also showed that increased time spent on social media led to distractions and lower overall study time. But. Trey Parker's rule of replacing and with but or therefore. Yes, Trey Parker of South Park. Which is, you take a story, and you've got a story, you've got the skeleton of a story, a script. You're like, well, how does this become more engaging? Well, you go through, and every time you find the word and, you stick a but there instead. Academics, we in the space, love and, because we love nuance and caveat. And we're talking to our peers who we know are all about punching holes in things because we're playing this status game and it's our job. Got it. So when we talk, we default to footnoting and qualifying everything we say, right? Yes. Which means we talk like this. And. So we do like a long linear sequence of I am demonstrating to you that I have taken everything into consideration. Again, then that is not bad. It just means that when we talk, we talk in very linear strings very often. But, therefore, Trey Parker is simply trying to get at making causal relationships between things that are not and. And is not a story. Thing, but, therefore, therefore, I'm engaging in some kind of narrative. Laurie Lingard's problem gap hook heuristic. This was developed more for explaining research in the context of funding applications, actually. And Laurie and her team found that basically funding proposals that take this approach actually tend to do better, which is lead with the problem. Here's the problem. Like, the first thing I am going to tell you about, the first thing out of my mouth is, here is a problem. And there is a gap. There is a gap between the problem and the solution. And here is the gap. We have a big problem. We have a big gap. And my hook is how I am going to communicate what we're going to do about those two things. So examples. Problem. Despite advances in technology, many rural areas still lack reliable internet access. Okay, it's a problem. Gap. Previous studies have focused on the technological solutions, but there's limited research on the impact of policy changes. Hook. So I'm coming in with, okay, what am I doing? What are we doing? Our research aims to explore how policy changes can bridge the digital divide and transform communities. So problem, gap, hook is a Great way to kind of sketch pad out the architecture of a talk as well. Just if you can convince me at the very beginning there is a problem and I care about it, I'm with you. Like take me there. So it's a great way to begin. Randy Olson's and but therefore framework. Randy Olson is a science communicator. This is very similar. The last kind of example I'll use, but it's you take two things, add them together with an and, you put a but, and then you put a therefore. Climate change is a pressing issue, and global temperatures have been steadily rising, but there's widespread skepticism and a lack of understanding about the causes and impacts of climate change. Therefore, our research focuses on developing effective communication strategies to engage public understanding and encourage actions to mitigate climate change. Just a way, again, I would, in the context of a research talk, it's like taking that as an idea. And as we've talked about, all we're really doing here is just getting those buts and therefores into the stream. Your presentation will be no better than the story you tell. That's the proposition. So I encourage you to invest the effort to give it a narrative arc, to give it a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know how it starts. You know the conflict that's going to be a part of the journey. You know where you're going to take me, and you know how it's going to end. By the way, in terms, and we'll get to kind of public speaking things in a minute, in terms of standing in front of people and saying words, this is gold. Once you know the story you're going to tell, and you know the beginning, middle, and an end, and you know how it starts, and you know where we're going, you can get knocked off course any which way, from like your lapel mic falling off to the PowerPoint breaking to whatever. But you know where you're taking us. You know where you're going. That can be so helpful just in terms of the personal confidence we have in presenting.